Women have been important leaders throughout church history. There are multiple stories in the Old and New Testaments about the powerful and unique ways women lead. Think Deborah, Ruth, Esther, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Phoebe, Priscilla, and more. And there are desert mothers and women such as Julian of Norwich, Clare of Assisi, and Teresa of Avila, who have given us wisdom for the ages. Sometimes out in front, sometimes behind the scenes, but always women have contributed to the spiritual and relational life of the church. Today, my guest is Kimberly Deckel, and we are going to dive into the important role of women and how she comes alongside women in ministry to encourage and empower. Are you ready to invest in your capacity as a leader who cares well for the souls of others? Then join us in PACE, a certificate in leadership and soul care. PACE is perfect for you if you want to grow in spiritual leadership, perspectives, and skills. If you're tired of being overwhelmed and you want to cultivate healthy rhythms of life and leadership. And if you want to lead others in sustainable ways. Sharpen your leadership skill set from the inside out. There has never been a better time to give focused attention on your own spiritual life so you can help others do the same. Stop succumbing to the time urgency of our culture. Engage the gracious pace of Jesus and learn how to guide others into this life-giving way. Let us walk alongside you as you do this. PACE is an intensive 21-month cohort training process. To learn more, go to unhurriedliving.com/PACE. As I mentioned, my guest today is Kimberly Deckel, and we are going to dive into the important role of women and how she comes alongside women in ministry to encourage and empower. Kimberly Deckel is the executive pastor at Church of the Cross in Austin, Texas. Before transitioning into full-time ministry, Kimberly worked in the field of social work for over a decade, serving as therapist, hospice, social worker, and working in foster care and adoptions. She completed her MA in Missional Theology through the Missional Training Center and served as a priest and church planter in Phoenix, as well as the director of operations for Surge Network. Kimberly's husband is Steve, and her daughter is Keenan. I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Kimberly Deckel. Well, Kimberly Deckel, thank you so much for joining me today on the Unhurried Living Podcast.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
I'm so glad. We were just chatting beforehand how we kind of feel like we know each other, but we really don't because there's this social media dynamic.
Yes. And also, I mean, I've met your husband, right? And so interacting with him, I think that adds to it too. It's like both of those things. So
yeah.
Here though.
Yeah, I'm sure Alan must have mentioned this here or there whenever he does episodes, but he is in the same diocese as Kimberly. The Church is for the Sake of Others. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, which is going to be really great, what Kimberly does in there with women and other things. But I thought before we jump into all of that, I kind of like to start a little more personally. Yeah. You know, a little bit about your own journey with God, your own relationship, and how it did eventually unfold into sort of who you are now and what you do.
Yeah. So of course, I mean, as most people would say, like it is a very long story. I will not give the whole story. But I'll start with, I grew up in a home that wasn't a Christian home. I actually grew up in a home though where we attended the Unitarian church. And so I had a sense of what it was to belong to sort of a religious community, if you will, as a child. But then also at a very young age began having questions. Like in our Unitarian church, certainly we talked about God and even Jesus, but talked about Jesus not as the Son of God, right? Of course, like Unitarian, it wasn't a Trinitarian belief system. And so started having questions at a really young age about God and Jesus and about the Trinity. And I think just was, a pretty curious child. And the church I grew up in was a space where I was able to ask those questions and I didn't feel ostracized or shamed or anything like that. But it became pretty clear, like when I was in grade school, that I didn't quite like align in my beliefs or where I was kind of heading with the church I grew up in. And I actually have these really distinct memories from childhood where, like, in the moment and as a kid, couldn't have articulated it. But as I've, processed my own faith journey, my own coming to know Jesus, these really significant moments of Jesus being really present to me as even just like a young child. And so fast forward quite a bit in middle school, became a Christian. I started tagging along with friends to church. I had two friends whose dads were pastors and would go to church with them in youth groups and things like that. But for me, while I became a Christian in middle school, and that obviously feels like a very significant part of my faith journey, it really wasn't until college that that my faith kind of felt more like my own. As a kid, I was still attending church with my family most of the time too. So I was kind of like many Sundays going to two different churches and different youth groups and things like that. But in college, and it was interesting because my parents never said to me, "You have to come to church with us also." But I don't know. I'm like the oldest child, a little bit of a perfectionist, grew up in a home with some dysfunction. And so just always felt responsible for everything and everybody. So in college, I no longer felt like I needed to go to church with my family. And that was really just in so many ways where my faith really, just matured more. It was before that, though, that I began feeling a call to pastoral ministry. A piece of why women in leadership is significant to me is because when I first started like kind of noticing this call from the Lord in high school, I didn't have any women around me who were leading in churches and really not in ministry settings either. And so let's see, college, my faith really began to form a lot. I was involved in college ministries, things like that. And then, fast forward a whole bunch more into kind of my early to mid 30s. And the Lord really orchestrated several things at once in my life that I never could have planned things this way. I started seminary for fun. I like learning. If I could, would just, always be in school. And I really believed that. It was really like, oh, I'm going to do this for fun. It was this really kind of interesting program in Phoenix, which is where we lived at the time. I also at that time met one of my now closest friends. And the very first time we met, she's very prophetic in her giftings. She said, you're supposed to pastor, right? This is what you're called to. And it was one of those moments, it still gives me chills talking about it, where it was just, really hard to kind of ignore that. And then I also got connected with an Anglican church planter in Phoenix who was looking for a person of color to plant with, not a woman. And so we laughed at that a bit. And he was not opposed to a woman, but just really clearly had the sense of a diverse co-planting team. And so all those things kind of happened within a few months of each other. And then, here I am today in Austin now as a priest in the ACNA in our diocese, as you mentioned, Churches for the Sake of Others, and then an executive pastor at Church of the Cross. So that's almost 44 years sped up. So
sped up into 5 minutes.
Yes, that's about
Thanks for the overview. I'm sure there's many more stories within each one of those as to how the calling came to be and how it came to fruition.
Yes.
But thanks for the drive-by on that. Yeah. Maybe we could start with kind of where you ended up now in the diocese for Churches for the Sake of Others. What is your role there? You said you're an executive pastor at your church, so maybe a little bit about that too, but also the specific role in C4SO, which is what we call it. Yes. What does that entail?
Yeah. So at Church of the Cross, my family and I relocated here just a little over 2 years ago from Phoenix. And I love so many of the pieces of my vocation as a priest and a pastor. There's a little cat ear. But I also do love organizational pieces of my role of just helping implement processes, especially as our church has grown and we've purchased a building and things like that. So that's, sort of the local piece. And then within our diocese, I serve in this volunteer role as the bishop's liaison to women in leadership. And it's kind of morphed in a few ways over the last couple of years. And honestly, we're still figuring some of it out, what that looks like. But really a piece of it is just recognizing that and it, this goes back to even me, kind of this initial, noticing of like a calling, right, to pastoral ministry in the late 90s, and just noticing like there are not a lot of women. And then as I talk to women who are my colleagues, in the ACNA, but also women in just so many different ministry and church settings, so much of like these spaces, oftentimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, are really created for men. And so there's just sometimes it's very small things, other times it's pretty large things that are just kind of overlooked and just not really like created for women in the ways in maybe which we're gifted and we lead. Even just like this is a really small kind of silly example, but like retreats. Oftentimes it's like, hey, everybody, bring your pipes. We're going to hang out and smoke. There are women who smoke pipes, and that is fine. And it's fine for men to smoke them too. But there's just these interesting things. And that's like a really small, silly example. But just ways in which this world is like very much created for men. And then women are overlooked, like, in the ways that we think of just in terms of jobs, even churches that are open to female clergy and having them, a lot of times don't. And sometimes that, it's not that it's rarely an intentional thing. But oftentimes it even just has to do with like the types of roles that are created and the things that they're looking for, or maybe roles that are just very inflexible and wouldn't work well for like a woman with children, but might work well for a man who's working full time, whose wife is a stay-at-home mother, Mm-hmm. So there's things like that just kind of in the day-to-day, like we hit up against. And so a piece of my role is just kind of being a little bit of like helping bridge that gap a little bit. And so that's even where it's like kind of liaising with the bishop around like, ooh, I noticed that this might be something where we've kind of like missed women or not thought about the unique ways in which our female clergy are impacted by this. Helping just have eyes around roles that are created in churches, in the diocese, and how they can be roles that would make sense for both men and for women. Some of it, too, is just supporting female clergy in the diocese. Certainly, they have support from their rectors and other clergy, but again, just really specific needs that women might come across that men might experience differently, and that just because of, like a lack of understanding formation around this, there's a lack for women. So
I'm really
So those are some of the things. Welcoming new women into the diocese when we have clergy transfer, helping create connection points for our women in the diocese, spaces just for them to talk and connect.
That's wonderful. Yeah, there is definitely a different dynamic. Yes. For sure. And I'm so glad. I love our bishop anyway, Todd Hunter, how he is trying to really help everybody in the way or serve people and, help them be seen.
Yep. And just recognizing that men and women are gifted differently at times. And, and also I think a piece of it too, is just that there are really important unique things that women can offer as leaders in their churches. And so also just really helping to cultivate those things and recognizing that when we only have men or predominantly have men leading, even our people are missing out on some of the things that women have to offer.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Well, obviously, we believe in male and female leadership here at Unhurried Living because Ellen and I co-lead. And we believe definitely in our who we are individually, but also together as a strengthened masculine, feminine voice in the same stream. It's just so good. It's so
good. Yeah.
To have both perspectives. Yeah. And I think men and women can learn from men and women.
Right.
We can learn hopefully from the best of who we are.
And it's such a gift for our people, for the kids in our churches, for it to even just be normalized to see men and women leading together is really important.
Yeah. So I remember when we first started attending Holy Trinity, which was the church plant that Todd and Debbie started back, 10 years, maybe a little more than 10 years ago, maybe 15 now. I just remember that when we first started going, there was a definite bias toward, because, we're liturgical, we're Anglican. So there's, the scriptures and the music and the prayers of the people. And there's all these different parts that move through the service. And it took me a year before I really realized I was being formed, because every other person that would come up and do something, it was male, female, male, female, male, female. And so you were getting both voices every single week. And I remember talking to one of our associate pastors. She's no longer there, but she was a woman. And I said, I think you and Todd have created something here that has healed me in a way. I knew I needed healing here, but I wasn't really asking for it. But just the way you are putting the service together made me feel seen and held and included. And it wasn't even a big deal. It's just, there's a woman reading scripture. Yay.
Yeah. It's oftentimes like actually much simpler than we realize. But then the impact can be so profound. And I think like I've heard very similar things from so many different men and women, right?
Yes.
About seeing that.
Oh, yeah. You'd probably hear something very similar from Alan if he were to talk about this dynamic as well. But you mentioned a little bit about the differences, but I wonder if you could go even a little more personal. What do women in leadership need? What are you hearing? And along with that, again, how is that different from what the men need? Maybe on another layer down from what you were mentioning.
Yeah. So what I hear from so many women is, and again, I think this is what makes it a little tricky, is that rarely is any of this intentional. Rarely is anybody ever saying like, I'm going to create this space that is more for a man than it is for a woman. But so many of the women are just like, I think you even just said this for yourself, like needing to like have a sense of being seen. Right. And so oftentimes, the way that roles have been created at churches, there's sort of this implicit bias, and where they're created really a bit more for a man. And whether it's what I mentioned earlier, just kind of more practical things around like the hours that are expected, like, or how many evenings or things like that. Even just, so that's one example of it. Or just like sort of the structure of a Sunday or things like that just like cater a bit more like to somebody who might be the only person like working outside of the home, that make it a little bit trickier for like a young mother or something like that. But then also, oftentimes, like as I'm talking to women in this kind of idea of being seen, it's just like some specific giftings being overlooked or maybe not valued as much. And so many of my male colleagues who are priests are so pastoral and really able to be present with their people. But that is not always true. And like women feeling like, oh, I have these gifts to offer pastorally and in being present with people, but feeling sometimes like those aren't seen or valued in the same ways. And that sometimes it's kind of like, got to keep moving along, like kind of, focus on like the goals, that kind of a thing. One of the other things that I hear, and this isn't specifically this is what clergy hear from females in their church, is just how significant it is to have female pastors. Sometimes it's the leading, like you mentioned, like sort of from the front in a sense, but also when there's a marriage that's struggling, for a woman to not only have a male pastor to talk to, or things that like women deal with uniquely, like related to our bodies, right? For so long, in so many churches, women only have male pastors to talk with about that. And even like the kindest, most pastoral, Jesus-y, male pastor, like it's just not the same as sitting with a woman. And so like hearing that from female clergy, but sometimes feeling like it's not, like just the significance of that maybe isn't always recognized. Also, just a lack of paid roles for women in churches. So it's hard enough to. I mean, I feel so privileged to have like a full-time paid role in a church, just generally speaking. But then as a woman of color, and so there's so few roles, and then there's even fewer for women, and so that's just sort of a lament, really, right? Just that. There's so many, or there's so few roles for women. So those are some of the things. And then just misses sometimes on people's parts that can affect women in different ways, even around just people's opinions on women in ministry and leadership, that there's not always like a sensitivity to it, even in an amazing diocese where leadership is fully in support of that. Like that can be overlooked at times, and can create spaces that don't feel safe for our women.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm wondering in what you do with Todd then, if you're noticing things, does he have conversations with you and then is action taken
Yes,
to talk with church leadership teams about what's going on?
Yeah. And I think the way that so like I mentioned, we're kind of like learning as we go with some of the women in leadership piece and like, what does this look like? And in this year have some new things, more, just like times of connecting, and at the clergy retreat, a time we're working on like just for women to connect and hike and like have a meal together. But some of the work up until this point, like really has been just noticing different things that are happening that might need extra attention as they relate to women. And so one of my favorite things about Bishop Todd is he says this, and it's so true about him. He's just like a lifelong learner and always open to new ideas. To like a phone call if there's something that I might notice or I've heard from somebody that needs some attention. And so he acts on those things. We can have real transparent conversations around them, and then there's follow-up, and oftentimes it's even just questions around where or are more places we can invite women in to lead in the diocese, because even that is a significant thing, just having women lead more. Even many of the ministries we have within the diocese, while they're not specifically for men, again, unintentionally, they really are catering predominantly to men. And our diocese actually we have like 40 some odd female clergy, which is a ton, but it's still like proportionally fewer than the men. And so even just things like that, like how can we have more female presence, women leading, so that we don't make even like some of these mistakes, where there's like a woman, like a female's voice and perspective. It's the same idea. You need diversity in terms of race and ethnicity too, right? All of that. I like Bishop Todd is always taking action. And oftentimes like after a call, like right after, we'll get a follow-up message like, hey, this is what I'm thinking and what I'm going to be doing. And so I'm really, really thankful for that. And that like personally is what allows me to kind of like keep doing it. Like, I think it would feel pretty hard if it's like, have all these conversations, no change actually happens, and it feels like I'm just like talking to myself,
Oh, that would be frustrating. Yeah. Well, even one of the things you said a couple of minutes ago in passing about just having a woman in the room.
Yep.
Even if whoever's listening to this, there's probably all different kinds of people listening to this, whether they have women on leadership teams or not.
Right.
Even just having a wise woman in the room, if there's a woman with you or if there's a couple, just to have that, again, that both perspective.
Yes.
I really hear you saying that the both and.
Right.
So good. Well, I wonder too, I guess I'm continuing just to drill down, because not only are there needs sort of vocationally and in the ministry, the leadership aspect of women, but what are you hearing these days from women in leadership as far as their deepest felt needs? It's a complicated world right now. Women are juggling a lot of things if they're in ministry leadership. I mean, anxiety, loneliness, the things that we're hearing about. What's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, so many. So I think that, one of the things kind of goes back again to something I mentioned earlier, and that is just like women who are older, wiser, have been doing this work for a while, just to be mentors and present to them. I know even like for us in our own church, our church is a pretty young church. And so oftentimes we'll have new parishioners, especially who will come in and kind of ask, like, are there people who can mentor me who are older? And they're not asking specifically even about like clergy, right? They're asking for, like parishioners who've been around for a while. But I hear that so much from our women in leadership too. The ACNA is young, our diocese is young. And so therefore, I don't know what the average age is of like our female clergy, but it's pretty young. And so that's one of those things that is just lacking. We can't do like a ton about it right now. It's one of those things where got to wait a little bit for some of us, to get older. But just feels like such a significant thing because of like the unique things that we face as women, right? That like many of these women have great men who are mentoring them in different ways, but who just their experiences just look different. Things oftentimes like move a little bit quicker or might have been a little bit easier for some of the men, even just around like if they're looking toward vocational aspirations, things like that. And then certainly, yeah, just I think what we see in culture generally for women, and then we see the same thing in church and ministry, just women balancing, juggling so many different things, and oftentimes feeling like they have to like perform better than their male counterparts.
Yeah.
So there really is kind of this, I think, again, it's like kind of unspoken, but there's like this bar for women. It's a little bit higher, a little bit more is expected. And sometimes that's self-imposed, but I also think it's absolutely true that that's a part of the culture that we live in too.
Yeah.
And it comes into church too and into ministry settings.
Yeah. And that's a lot of pressure to bear up under, especially, isn't it a little bit insidious because we're all doing our best to love and serve God and others with gladness and singleness of heart, right?
Yeah. Yes. There's all these pressures. And so some of it is like, it's a slowing down, helping women, really center on and focus on like who they are in Jesus, right? Like that they are beloved, and that like all of the overperforming in the world like doesn't matter to God, and that's easier said, right, than done. But it is a really helpful reminder when women are feeling like especially anxious or really feeling those pressures, and then just noticing the ways in which it impacts them in their work, but also in their life outside of work, family.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm so glad they have you as this liaison position so that you're listening and you're seeing them and you're hearing, and then you guys are working together to care. I just think this conversation is so important that we, and I've also noticed in your language, you're absolutely not trying to talk about us versus them in any way, that there's just sometimes we're just missing things and we just need to talk about how it's coming across or what's going on and how we can be more sensitive or helpful.
Yeah, I think so. In my experiences with my male colleagues, is that they're all like that they're like wanting to learn.
Yeah.
They appreciate someone helping them kind of notice these things. And that is a piece of it too. And one of kind of the longer term things we hope for is how do we help them? Like, because in so many of these situations, it is men leading just because of, just how things have kind of worked out. Right.
Yeah.
And so how do we help them to be, good, leaders, rectors with the female staff or clergy that they have? Because they all they desire that. And we, are all like in this work together for the good of the kingdom.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the other things that you, as you counsel some of these female leaders, what are some of the things that you share with them, as they are sharing with you some of these things you just told me?
Yeah.
What are you saying to them? Yeah.
So much of it is like a kind of real, like the slowing down piece, which I know like you understand well, because oftentimes, that's a lot of the ways that we're operating and where a lot of like the anxieties come in is due to just like the fast pace of life and of ministry and all of that. And so oftentimes when we're able to kind of slow down and sort of be present to like the actual reality of who we are and how Jesus sees us, that can be really helpful. But another piece of it is like working on, because so often there's like a desire for mentor and connection with other women. Oftentimes it's just this real sense of like loneliness. I think that ministry and church work can be really lonely for men and for women, even when we have a team around us. It's just such a different type of work. And so a lot of times it's just like a practical kind of like working with them through like, what are the things that you need to, in order to continue going and to continue doing this work in a healthy way. And a lot of times that is just like connection with other women. And I will say too, that it's not as if all of the conversations with women are like, these are the things that are wrong. And it's so hard. Oftentimes it's just to like listening to the work that they're doing and recognizing, like their gifts, their strengths, because that's, again, like I think for all of us true that it can just be really easy to feel like overlooked at times, or it's hard to recognize maybe the ways in which we're doing our job well. And so that's oftentimes what it is. And then also, especially as we look toward this new year and trying to implement some new things, it's getting ideas from other women too and support, because like I can't do all of this. And so it's just it's like picking the brain of other female leaders within our diocese as well.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. I think that connection, again, being heard. I mean, obviously, with the heart of a spiritual director here, I mean, just the ministry of present listening, empathy. I mean, that can go so far.
Right.
To just encourage.
It's pretty simple,
It really is, isn't it?
Yeah.
To be seen and to be heard.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, as you think over your life, who were some of your important mentors? How did they breathe life into your own leadership journey?
Yes. So thinking back even to childhood, one thing I forgot to mention is that my mom's family was very Irish Catholic. And so I was actually baptized as an infant in the Catholic Church. And so I have a godmother who's my mom's cousin, who to this day is someone that is a part of my life. I mean, she lives far away. And in so many ways, I mean, I think when I look back to just kind of my faith and my formation, she's been really significant in many ways, like as a godmother should be. And I think that even, in my kind of family of origin where faith centered in Jesus was not a significant thing, I was always able to look at my godmother, Carol, and her faith, and even just her family and how she parented her children and how that was just really central to who they were. And then in college, again, I was involved in college ministry. I was a student athlete, and so I was really involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and had a couple of female leaders in that space too, who were also just really just leading in everyday ways, nothing huge and flashy or anything like that, but were present to us. I think also just felt really known by them, and just began to sort of see what it looked like to be a woman leading. And it was different. It was a ministry space, not a church space, but just felt really significant when I think about my journey. And then in Phoenix, there's this ministry. It's a little bit younger than me. It's how I always remember the age. It's 43 years old, and called Neighborhood Ministries. And it is been around for forever. And the woman who is the president of that is a woman named Kit Danley, and she's been leading it and started what's now this huge ministry that has a kids club with hundreds of kids, a medical clinic, a store, a Head Start, foster care and adoption for unaccompanied minors, all the things you can imagine, a church. And she, is almost 70 and has been leading this and building this, along with the help of Jesus and so many others through the years. And it has done it in this way where a lot of people wouldn't be oh, Kit is a pastor, but she is. And she's been, just really significant in my life, just through watching the work that she does, but also as a mentor and somebody who I can ask questions and pick her brain, especially in the times that it feels especially hard as a woman.
Yeah. So it sounds like people who are older is meaningful. People who have experience and who are modeling what you want to be or what you aspire to be. It's important to have people like that sort of ahead of you.
Yes.
Those are speaking. True. So good. I've found that too. My mentors obviously were all older than me. I mean, it's just, and what's unfortunate now at my age is that many of them are passing away now. And so I'm becoming sort of that age group now that is in that space. And so it's hard to have them be sort of moving on.
Yeah. And then to be yourself sort of that, the next generation kind of.
I know it's kind of a crazy place to be in.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm wondering, is there, I wanted to say for women in ministry, so maybe we'll start there, but maybe we'll have a secondary question. Mm-hmm. What are some life-giving counsel that you might give to any women in ministry leadership that are listening, especially in regards to what we talk about here at Unhurried Living is, it's the inner to the outer, right? The contemplation and action.
Yeah.
Right? How does that, what would you say to them that they're listening right now that might encourage them or bolster them or help them?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things I would first say is that if there are any like doubts, any feelings of like imposter syndrome, because
Yeah.
I hear that a lot from women and have experienced those things myself, that like those things are not from God, and that in that there is just kind of this, again, like this slowing down and this like remembering of who you are in Jesus and who Jesus is, how Jesus sees you, how God has created you. And that those things, like those kind of negative messages we hear, the doubts that we have that sort of weigh us down, like we can hand those over to the Lord.
Mhm.
And then I think with that too, like some of the next steps, and this is easier said than done, but it's like finding women to connect with.
Yeah.
And it requires like a boldness
Yeah.
sometimes, because there may not be a woman like in your church or in your neighborhood. But I think that's one of those things too, where like we're handing to the Lord, like spending time praying and discerning through what that looks like. But I think that it's just so important to have other women to connect with when we're like already working in ministry or discerning work in ministry. And then all like the reminder to like, again, like Jesus sees you, Jesus loves us as women, and ministered alongside women. Like we were called to this, and just a very important, like an important part of the body. And so those things, like just those kind of like affirmations, reminders about who we are, and then also just finding people to connect with who can just listen, who can provide empathy.
Yeah.
Those things I think are just really important and life giving, and allow
Yeah.
us to like, continue this work.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm wondering too if you have a message for men in leadership,
Uh,
what would be an explicit way to
mhm.
honor and respect women who are serving and leading in our own churches?
Yeah. So I think an explicit way, and this requires, again, like a slowing down and maybe even like jotting out some notes, but it's just like taking some time to pause and recognize the really unique ways in which the women who are serving in your context, like the unique things that they have to offer to that church and ministry that maybe like are different than what you offer or their male counterparts. And again, like that's not to say that men and women can't have some of the same giftings, but that's why it's important to have men and women serving together, because oftentimes like our giftings and our strengths are different. And so I think there's just, and I think that, men would probably like really like welcome it too. But there's just something really important about, I think, slowing down, recognizing like, why are you thankful? Like, what is it that you see happening in your church? How do you see Jesus using like the women who are serving in ways that are just really blessing your people?
Yeah.
It's easy to overlook that often.
Yeah.
It's easy, again, because women are often like, the bar is higher. And so they're like working and working and working. And it can just create the space where they feel pretty, I think, unseen.
Yeah. I've heard that theme come up a couple of times in our conversation, just the simplicity of listening and seeing,
Yeah. It's so
and then having a
important.
conversation.
Yes. And it's like, and
Yeah.
again, like can feel scary and like
Yeah.
there's vulnerability in it, but believe that that's a really important part of our life with Jesus and in
Yeah.
church and ministry. And like those, we want to model those things because we also want our parishioners to be like living lives that reflect that too.
Yeah. Makes so much sense. Well, I do one final question, but before I ask that, I'm just going to ask real quick is there a way for people to connect with you online if
Yeah.
they wanted to learn more about you or more from you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a big social media presence. Like I'm on
Okay.
Instagram and it's mostly pictures of like my child or my animals or something like that.
Yeah.
But I am on Instagram and it's my name. It's funny because I'm like, I think it's like Kimberly_Deckel. But also, I mean, our church website, which is cotcaustin.org. My
Okay.
email address is on there. I'm happy, like love getting emails. Love being invited to like into um, prayer. Have a few women just come from different spaces, even outside of our diocese, that I've connected with through the years. And I'm involved in, just like a piece of kind of their like daily like prayer cycles. Would love to, like hear how other women are serving and even just, like how they're feeling encouraged in the work
Yeah.
that they do too. I think I can feel sometimes like we're alone and like there's not a lot of women doing this work, but I think I often end up surprised when I begin hearing from other women or connect with them in different ways by how many there actually are.
Yeah. Yes. It is. I find that all the time in the ministry that we do.
Yeah.
Women they're serving and they're loving and they're tired.
Yeah.
And they're looking for a place to come where they don't have to lead. And so I try to have different ways in which women can gather as well, so that I can serve them and they can just be a person and just be encouraged and supported and helped, and we can pray and all of that. So it's critical. We can't go it alone.
Yeah.
And we don't want to. But somehow we end up sometimes just doing it, and then we're wiped out.
Yeah, like we shouldn't have to. God doesn't want us to, but we do, like we just kind of keep forging ahead. And it's just like a recipe for burnout,
It really is.
It for the long haul, I don't think.
It's so true. I just went away for a girls' weekend this last weekend, and there were 5 of us, and we laughed. We had no agenda. We knew we were going to share our hearts, and all of that was going to happen. But we just talked about how wonderful it was to just be in a room full of women. We just know.
Yeah.
We just know what's going on.
Yeah. It's just like these unspoken things kind of. Yeah. And that's again, like where I think there's just this extra level sometimes of exhaustion for women working in like predominantly male spaces, where like, again, the men aren't trying to create a space like that, but it just kind of is that way. And it's just the extra energy that it can require.
Totally. Oh, totally. Yeah. I've heard so many stories and I've experienced things myself. So, well, before we sign off, then maybe bring it all to a focused point. Is there one practical step anybody who's listening could take after hearing what you've shared today?
So I'll give 2, because I'll give one for the men and one for the women.
Okay.
So the women, like the really practical one probably is like, just think about like who are 1 or 2 like other women you can connect with, whether it's that you're like maybe going to be serving in a mentor role. Because I think like that feels important too, going back to the idea of people thinking about like, oh, who's somebody who could mentor me or who I look up to. Yeah. That takes a lot of courage sometimes. And so maybe even is there somebody you could reach out to that might need a listening ear or some support? That just feels, important. And like, it's easy. It's not easy, but we're oftentimes thinking about like what we need, but also like, I wonder if there's someone. And then I would just say for the men, it kind of goes back to the, like maybe just a little bit of a slowing down and a noticing like the spaces that you might be like leading in or even going to church in. Like how are women treated? Are there some like minor adjustments that could be made that might create a space that would feel safer, more welcoming for women?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kimberly. Great practical tips. I hope everyone's listening, and I hope that people will take you up on your offer to be connected with. Say it again. It's COTC?
COTC Austin.org. So it's Church of the Cross Austin.
Gotcha. Yeah. Go there. There'll be a staff link. They'll find you if you scroll down. Yeah. Yep. So connect with Kimberly. Well, Kimberly, again, thanks so much for being with us. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, everyone, thanks for joining me on the Unhurried Living Podcast. And remember, you're making your way forward one small, simple, and gracious step at a time.
You've been listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.